Welcome to the Explainer. Let's just dive right in, shall we? Today, we're unpacking one of the most profound, emotionally weighty, and historically sweeping texts in the Quran, is Surah Hud, known as Surah Hud. You know, when we read historical texts or religious scriptures, it's really easy to just view them as abstract words on a page. But what happens when a text carries so much gravity, so much stark warning, that it takes a literal physical toll on the person delivering it? Well, that's exactly the reality of Surah Hud.
There's this incredible exchange where the Prophet Muhammad's close companion Abu Bakr noticed that the Prophet was visibly aging. His hair was actually turning white, and when asked about it, the Prophet replied, "Surah Hud and the like surahs have made me old." Just let that sink in for a second. To understand why, we really have to look at the intense historical context here. This surah was revealed during a period of extreme hardship in Mecca. The Quraysh, who were the ruling tribe at the time, they were at the absolute peak of their persecution against the early Muslims. But the Prophet wasn't just stressed out by the persecution itself. As the sources point out, he was carrying the massive burden of these stern divine warnings. He knew the last limit of the respite given by God to his people was rapidly approaching, and he was absolutely terrified that their time would expire and they'd be seized by this inevitable torment.
All right, let's move into Section 1, the core message: obey, discard, and await the hereafter.
So what exactly was this incredibly heavy message? Well, Surah Hud basically strips away all the noise to lay out these foundational core directives. It tells people to obey the messenger, discard shirk, which is the practice of idolatry and associating partners with God, worship Allah alone, and crucially, establish your entire life on the belief that you will absolutely be called to account in the hereafter. The text makes it a very specific point to emphasize that the Prophet, and the prophets before him, didn't seek any worldly rewards, wealth, or power for doing this. According to the surah, they were entirely selfless. They relied only on divine support, simply seeking to guide their people to these truths. But, as the text illustrates, the people were just completely distracted.
That brings us to Section 2, the illusion of worldly power, the psychology of prosperity and despair.
This is honestly one of the most fascinating aspects of this text. It isn't just a list of rules to follow. It actually presents this really profound psychological profile of how humans react to the illusion of worldly power. Verses 9 through 11 outline what the text describes as a fundamental flaw in human nature. Think about it. When people experience prosperity, when they have wealth, power, and influence like the Quraysh did, the text says they become overjubilant and arrogant. They're totally blinded by the illusion that the good times are just going to last forever, and they scoff at any warning of accountability. But the exact moment that mercy is removed and adversity hits, total despair. They become hopeless and immediately ungrateful. So the text is depicting this shallow, superficial nature that fluctuates wildly based on whatever temporary material condition people happen to find themselves in. So the big question is, what's the antidote to this human condition? The surah actually provides one: sabr, or fortitude. Now, true sabr means remaining firm and completely unwavering in your purpose. A person with this quality isn't intoxicated by power when they're on top of the world, and they aren't depressed or crushed by adversity when the bottom falls out. They remain anchored to the truth regardless of life's ups and downs. And it's this exact steadfastness that the surah demands of the believers.
Moving on to Section 3, Echoes of Past Prophets, a cyclical pattern of history.
To really drive this lesson home, the surah maps out a massive historical timeline. We see this striking sequence of messengers: Noah and the Great Flood, Hud and the people of Ad, Saleh and the Thamud, Lot, Shu'aib, and finally Moses confronting Pharaoh. The text is using history here, not just as mere storytelling, but as a very severe warning about a cyclical pattern of human behavior. Despite being separated by vast spans of time and geography, every single one of these prophets brought the exact same core message. And tragically, every single one of these nations responded with that exact same arrogance we were just talking about.
If we synthesize the accounts straight from the text, we see exactly why these prosperous nations fell. It wasn't just some abstract spiritual disbelief. Their idolatry actually trickled down into severe moral and societal corruption. For instance, Shu'aib's people engaged in rampant commercial fraud, constantly cheating people in their weights and measures. Lot's people committed unprecedented immorality. Pharaoh and the people of Ad were just entirely consumed by arrogance and tyranny. The surah makes a very definitive theological claim here, which is that God did not treat these nations unjustly. Rather, the text asserts they brought about their own ruin through their persistent moral failings and their outright refusal to heed clear warnings. According to the scripture, their destruction was entirely self-inflicted.
Now, Section 4, Ties of Faith over Blood, the story of Noah and his son.
Let's zoom in on a really heart-wrenching narrative that forces us to confront a pretty difficult question. What defines true family? When it comes down to ultimate truth and divine justice, do biological ties actually matter, or is there something much deeper at play?
As the floodwaters were rising like mountains, the text recounts Noah desperately calling out to his son to get on the ark. But his son stubbornly refused, basically saying he'd just go find refuge on a mountain. When the wave finally took him, Noah, suffering from the completely natural grief of a father, pleaded with God, saying his son was of his family. The divine response here is just staggering. It says, "O Noah, he is not of your family. He has turned out to be a worthless act." The commentary explains this beautifully. It suggests a child is like a piece of work entrusted to a parent to mold into a righteous person. But if they actively choose the path of corruption and reject the truth, they become a worthless act. The text heavily emphasizes that spiritual alignment and righteous conduct actually supersede even your closest biological ties.
And that brings us to a stark realization about the nature of divine justice presented in this text. Gone are the workers of iniquity. This decree highlights that divine judgment is absolute and it's impartial. The Quraysh genuinely believed their lineage to Prophet Abraham would somehow save them. But within the context of the surah, this definitively shatters that illusion. No one, not even the literal son of a great prophet, is spared based on blood or lineage alone if they are workers of iniquity. According to the text, individuals are judged solely by their faith and their actions.
Which leads us into Section 5, Standing Firm in Truth, the Ultimate Directive. As we move from these intense historical lessons back to the present moment for the prophet, and really, by extension, for the reader today, we arrive at verse 112. The conclusion of Surah Hud is empowering, but it is incredibly stern. In fact, this verse is widely considered the focal point of that heavy burden the prophet felt. It reads, "So remain on a right course as you have been commanded." Just imagine the sheer weight of that command. Surrounded by hostile enemies, facing daily ridicule, and knowing the terrifying fate of past nations, the prophet is commanded to simply stay upright. Do not compromise. Do not lean towards the wrongdoers even a little bit. Remaining totally steadfast on the right course when the entire world is pushing against you, well, that's exactly why this surah aged the prophet.
But the text doesn't just drop this heavy command and walk away. It provides the actual mechanism to carry it out. How does the text say you maintain this impossible-sounding right course? First, establish salat, prayer, at the two ends of the day and early night. The surah posits that these good deeds actively remove evils, kind of acting as this continuous spiritual reset. Second, practice that sabr, that deep fortitude we defined earlier, trusting fully that the reward of those who do good is never, ever wasted.
And that brings us to our final takeaway. The sources highlight this concept in Surah Hud called the law of respite. The idea is that a delay in consequence isn't an absence of justice. Rather, the text argues it's a period of grace. God gives people and whole nations time to mend their ways before the time limit finally expires. So, I want to leave you with this to reflect on. How do you respond to the law of respite in your own life? When you experience periods of prosperity, peace, and extra time, do you become boastful and arrogant like the nations of the past, just assuming it'll last forever? Or do you use that time to establish your course, practice fortitude, and truly align yourself with the truth? The history of the world, at least exactly as Surah Hud presents it, hinges entirely on how we answer that question.